Hello and welcome to the third Eyebrow Cinema Q&A special. To celebrate 50,000 subscribers, I'm going to be answering your burning questions starting right now. AGSMA asks, choose only one movie per genre in case you get stranded on an island. I think the smartest way to answer this question is to really break it down into a series of minute subgenres to get as many films as possible to accompany me to this island. So like, action movie, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, action-adventure, Raiders of the Lost Ark, sci-fi action, RoboCop, action horror, aliens, action comedy, police story. Basically just keep spiraling out into various niche subgenres until I have a library's worth of movies to keep me company. The goal is that I get rescued before I'm even through with all the movies. Owen Jackson asks, what are your thoughts on directors tinkering with their films after their initial release in the vein of George Lucas? Are they in their right to do so, or should it be left alone? The key factor for me is if the original version of the film is still available. I think directors should be welcome to tinker with their movies as much as they want, provided that the new version, the tinkered with version, does not become the default version. Lucas being the primary example of this, because famously you can't watch the original Star Wars cuts unless you have the old laser discs or VHS tapes, because they're just not publicly available, and certainly not in modern high-definition quality. And to that end, I really love the Blu-rays that I have for Blade Runner or Close Encounters of the Third Kind or Apocalypse Now, which come with all the cuts that were available at the time those Blu-rays released. So, yeah, I'm okay with directors tinkering with their work, just let me see the original. 2 questions from the Duke of Tumwater. First, what is the most absurd moral panic that a film has generated in your opinion, and what are your thoughts on the possibility of doing a video on film-related moral panics? And 2, who would be your top 3 choices for villains to appear in the next Batman movie, and who would you like to see play them? Okay, lots here. With regard to moral panics, I think the 2 that stand out to me the most are the moral panics over Joker and The Last Temptation of Christ, specifically because they were moral panics largely driven by people who had not yet seen the films and ended up being pretty off base in terms of what their objections to the works were. And as to your second question about which villains would I most want to see in the next Batman film, I think the 3 I'd want to see are, 1, the ventriloquist. Second villain I'd most want to see is Poison Ivy. And then the last villain I think I'd want to see is Man-Bat. Who do I cast in these roles? I don't really know. The ventriloquist is probably the hardest because I would want a legitimate ventriloquist in that role. I would want someone who can do the voice of the puppet. Not to say you can't help it in post-production, but I wouldn't want it to just be an actor playing a role and then they dub in Mr. Scarface later. So that makes it really tricky, and I don't know who, in terms of known actors in Hollywood, can do that, if there are any, or who could be trained to pull that off convincingly. In terms of the vibe of a character like that, I think someone like John Lithgow fits really well, because he can be both kind of a silly, affable old man, but he can also be a really vicious and monstrous, menacing presence. So I think that would work really well. But I don't know if he can be a ventriloquist, so who knows. Poison Ivy, the obvious casting choice, I think, is Jessica Chastain, redhead, who can be, sexy and an ingenue, but also like can portray righteous, justified anger. I think she fits perfectly, maybe a little too perfectly, to the point that she's the obvious choice, but she's certainly who comes to mind now. And then Man-Bat, you can go really any way you want, because the character in his sort of monstrous form would likely be a mix of most likely just CGI, but also you could use like makeup effects and prosthetics and animatronics. Point is, he's this monster though, so how you cast the human component is up to you. You can cast him as really like a mild-mannered normal guy, maybe someone like Tracy Letts, or you can lean into, kind of like the animated series did, someone who has the affect of almost a classic horror movie icon. But those are the 3 villains who I think would be the most interesting in this new iteration of Batman that we're seeing. 2 questions from Joshua Davis. 1, have you any interest in being part of film production, or do you see yourself exclusively engaging in analysis and critique? Great question. I've said in the past that I don't really have any interest in doing narrative fiction type films. I don't know. I don't think I can think creatively in that way. Something more in the realm of documentary or nonfiction I would be more interested in, and obviously never say never, and I think the skills that I've developed here and in school would be more transferable to something like that. But at the same time, I can't really say it's an active goal of mine or something that I'm working towards at the moment. And two, what works do you think have the closest resemblance to something you would create? What is something you love but don't think you'd ever actually produce something like it? Dan Olson's video essay, Line Goes Up, The Problem with NFTs. It's 2.5 hours. It is a dense, thorough deconstruction of the rise of NFTs and cryptocurrencies and how they arise and sort of what the underlying social problems that led to the creation are, what their consequences are, what their implications are. That is so thorough and detailed and educational and also really entertaining. And I think it's a masterful example of the video essay as a medium and tool for educational and enriching videos. I think it's excellent and an accomplishment that I really admire. I don't have any interest in making a video like that, in part because it's so rooted in a culture that I really don't have any knowledge or insight into in a sort of critical way, that I couldn't make something like that. But I really love that video, and I actually have watched it in addition to the first time I watched it, just to learn and to get a better understanding of the NFT problem. I've actually gone back to it several times more, in part because I think the arguments are just genuinely really gripping and well laid out, but in part just because I look at it as like an inspiration for how good a video essay can be, because it really does feel not so much like a YouTube video, but like a full-on documentary, and I admire it a lot, but I could never do it. Yours truly, Johnny Dollar, asks, could you recommend a good academic or dense mainstream book that is an overview of noir? I love the genre, but the more I learn casually, the less clear its boundaries become. That's a really good question. I'm not much of a noir expert. I studied a little bit in undergrad, but I never had like a course built around it or like a text exclusively devoted to noir. Although your point about its boundaries being somewhat nebulous is well taken, because while there is a sort of core definition of noir you could narrow down, the term is often used a lot more loosely, which sometimes can be interesting and worth doing, and sometimes I would argue is maybe misapplied. But in any event, in terms of works, I think I've never read this myself, either of what I'm going to recommend, so they're more on reputation. One is Ian Cameron's film noir book. It's called like Movie Noir Book or something like that. It's got a very generic title, but it's a collection of essays on film noir. It's one that gets cited a lot, and it's probably a good reference point for just getting a broad understanding of the genre, and because it's a collection of essays, a number of different viewpoints. And the other book I'd recommend is Dark City, The Lost World of Film Noir, written by Eddie Muller and published by TCM. As a TCM publication, it's written with a little bit more of a general audience in mind and more hobbyists and not strictly like scholars. So if you want something a bit more dense and complicated, then the Ian Cameron book is probably closer to what you're looking for. But Muller is knowledgeable in the field, and TCM's books, while I haven't read this one specifically, the ones I have read are a pretty good mix of being really informative and well-researched, but also really clear in its writing and really engaging and really encouraging for seeking out other films. So if you're also coming at this from the perspective of, I like this genre, and not only do I want to learn more about it, but I want to see more film noirs, I think this would be a really good guide. And certainly from watching some of Muller's cataloging and curating of noir on TCM, he's very good at giving context for those films and sort of drawing your interest into them. So that one is probably a really good place to start. Sean Scullion, the cinema himbo, asks, what in your opinion are the top 5 films of the 1970s? Ooh, that's tough. Okay, let's not think about this too hard. So number 1 is Godfather 1 and 2 as a tie. If that's cheating, then I'm a cheater. That's fine. I'm not separating them. Number 2, Barry Lyndon. Number 3, Apocalypse Now. Number 4, I'm going to go with Chinatown. And number 5, it's Taxi Driver. In fact, Taxi Driver 4 and then Chinatown number 5. And then Days of Heaven is an honorable mention. And Serpico and Dog Day Afternoon and MASH and McCabe and Mrs. Miller and The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon, and there's a lot. 5 is too hard for the 1970s. How could you do this to me, Sean? But just 5, Godfather 1 and 2, Barry Lyndon, Apocalypse Now, Taxi Driver, Chinatown. That I feel okay with as my top 5, even if I feel really bad about leaving Malick out of the list. No, I don't want to think about it too much. Just move on. Redheaded Jedi, do you like movies? I don't like movies. I love them. Herr Vonyek asks, is Apocalypse Now too perfect for a hot take video essay? Probably. I certainly don't have like a contrary, actually it sucks view of Apocalypse Now. Clearly, my list, I love the film. I might do a video on it in the future, though. If I have an angle or an idea or something about it I want to explore, I could do it, but I don't think it'd be one about running contrary to the popular perception of it as a great film, because I do think it's great. So a couple people asked about movie soundtracks. First, we have Bradley, coolest sounding soundtrack that perfectly complements the movie. And we also have Can Coca-Ball Conley, I don't know if I pronounced that right, who asks, what elements do you think make a good movie soundtrack, and do you have a favorite? Perhaps this deserves its own video. It might. So I will say, if this is a topic you want to hear me explore in more detail, I'm going to be doing a podcast episode for the Cinema in Seconds podcast where we talk about our favorite needle drops and film soundtracks more broadly. So keep an eye out on Cinema in Seconds wherever you listen to podcasts if you want to hear me really talk about that for a long time with some friends. But as far as a general answer, I think the two soundtracks that came to mind the first when this question came up were, one, the Rushmore soundtrack, just because it ended up sort of sneaking into my listening while I'm writing. It's one that I've now listened to probably dozens of times just when I'm like banging out a script for a video, so I love that one. In terms of informing the film and fitting the movie, and also going to Brad's point about like coolness, I think Dazed and Confused really takes it. And maybe that's an obvious choice, but what I find interesting is that it's a film that's soundtrack is an obvious selection of tracks. Like, a lot of the songs are classic rock staples. They're very common, well-known bands and hit songs, and yet somehow the way they're assembled and collected together, even though they're kind of the obvious choices and not the deep cuts, they are so perfect at replicating this feeling of like a bygone era that is brought to life with a mix of wistful nostalgia, but also a certain distance and maturity. And I think it just really complements the film perfectly. So even though it's full of iconic songs and maybe the easy go-tos if you want to do like a 70s soundtrack, I think it complements what Linklater and the cast and crew are doing perfectly. B-Man400 asks, 5 favorite non-Ghibli anime films. Okay. So, number 1 is definitely Akira, which is maybe the obvious choice, but, I mean, it's Akira, it rules. Number 2, I'm going to go Perfect Blue. Number 3, Angel's Egg. Number 4, Millennium Actress. And 5 is tricky. Most of the anime I've seen is Ghibli, so I haven't seen that much outside of it, and I'm kind of debating between 2 films for the 5th slot. One is Paprika, which I think is beautiful and just a visual marvel, and also really touching. But you'll also notice it's the 3rd Satoshi Kon in a list of 5, which feels maybe a little too repetitive. And the other is The End of Evangelion, which is a film that is pretty ambitious and visually spellbinding at points, and certainly raises a lot of food for thought, but is also really intensely tethered to the anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion. So you can't really watch it in isolation, which makes it a little difficult to recommend as a film in its own right. Part of me wants to give it to Evangelion for the sake of variety, but I think Paprika's better, so Paprika takes the 5th slot. So that's my top 5. Nadertot asks, is there any modern or recent movie that you think will be seen in the light of Citizen Kane, Casablanca, or Godfather level in 20 to 30 years? And if so, what movie? Well, my favorite film of the last 10 years is most certainly Martin Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street. I would love for it to be viewed in that kind of light in 20 to 30 years, and I think you're already seeing it start to solidify as one of the modern classics. Certainly, the filmmaking is invigorating and done with a level of not just skill and artistry, but like energy and just cutting power that is remarkable for a director of Scorsese's age. This is usually where you make, like, The Irishman is also a brilliant film and close to comparable in achievement to The Wolf of Wall Street, but it's the more expected film for Scorsese to be making in this age. Slow, contemplative, deeply concerned with morality. Wolf of Wall Street does not feel like a movie that a man makes at this stage of Scorsese's career, and it's remarkable that he's able to do so. But even beyond the impressive nature of that, I just think in terms of capturing the absurd degree of wealth and wealth worshipping and the consequences of incredibly vain and vapid one percenters wreaking havoc for the rest of the world with basically no consequence. No film that I've seen in recent memory captures that nearly as well as The Wolf of Wall Street, and the fact that it does so while also being gut-bustingly funny is just a massive achievement. So that, for me, is the best film of recent memory that I hope endures as a classic. Other films that I suspect will, Parasite, probably more than any film in recent memory, has the chances of enduring like that, in part because not only is it incredibly well made and incredibly complex and deep, it's also just a wicked entertainment. And the films you list in your question, Godfather, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, they are great entertainments in addition to being great art, and Parasite does that as well. And come to think of it, so does The Wolf of Wall Street. I also think Boyhood and Moonlight will endure as modern classics, or at least I certainly hope they will. Yeah, those I think are good answers. That I'll say is the films most likely to be seen as like the major classics of their era. Randall the Vandal, I've been thinking how film is the only art film to successfully be gatekept by the rich. In order for a movie to be seen as legit, with few exceptions, it has to be backed by lots of money. Unlike music and writing, it's inaccessible for average people. How do you think this can be helped? This is a tricky one. This is a big question. I will say that most art industries, or really all art industries, are to some extent gatekept by the rich. The fact that there's an industry in place means that you need to have a certain degree of both cultural capital and economic capital to really thrive. But you are right that movies are, even at their baseline, driven by economic capital. You need a certain degree of funding. Like, you'll read about films of like low budget success stories, and those budgets are still often thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not even like $1 million. And yeah, relatively that is low budget, but it's still an astronomical amount of money from a certain perspective. So yeah, I mean, how does one solve it? I don't really know. I think one thing that helps a lot is artist grants and assistance for art projects from governments. So programs and funds available for film students or for film graduates that sort of make that gulf between the rich who can afford to make films and those who can't a little smaller. Obviously, that is still gate kept because you don't just get an artist grant because you want one. You have to do a proposal. You have to show what your project is, what its goals are. You usually need some sort of portfolio body of work to establish your artistic practice as legitimate. So it is very literally gate kept. Those funds are highly managed about who gets access and who doesn't. And yeah, to some extent, the likelihood of who gets it is still determined by economic factors. Those who come from wealthier backgrounds are more likely to have the resources to be able to succeed. So that doesn't solve the problem necessarily, but it does help combat it. Something else that I think helps combat it is making sure that movie theaters and basically anywhere that exhibits and distributes movies doesn't fall strictly under the control of film studios. One of the reasons you have the explosion of, in 60s and early 70s Hollywood, the new Hollywood emerge the way it does, is that after the Paramount decrees, studios lose their ownership of film theaters, and so movie theaters need more programming. So in addition to taking the big Hollywood films, they start taking exploitation films. They take lower budget and independent films. They take foreign language movies. So suddenly you have a new type of film playing in theaters alongside the Hollywood system. You have an alternative to what exists out there, which allows for artists outside of the system, gives them some sort of foothold, some way into the industry. So yeah, I think combating the monopolistic tendencies of obviously things like Disney swallowing up all their competition, but even Netflix producing their own content and really tightly managing and controlling what gets seen on their own platforms. And Disney and Warner are getting into that as well. So destabilizing those monopolies and artist grants, I think, are the main ways to combat it. How can average people like you and I fix that? I have no idea. Great question, though. That's honestly... that could fuel like a much longer project than a quick answer in a Q&A, but I did my best. So we got a couple questions about over and underrated qualities. So Dusty of Blue Bidya Games asks, overrated and underrated director, composer, actor, writer. Matt the Snapper asks, what popular movie do you not like that is widely loved? Living Failure asks, what are some movies that are your personal favorites but don't seem to get as much love as they should? Some hidden gems. And finally, Sifat Shams asks, are there movies you love in a particular genre that hardly anyone else has even heard of that you love specifically because it does something that no other film of its kind has ever done? So a couple different thoughtful questions from a couple different people. I'm kind of putting them in one category because they're all kind of dancing around the same idea, which is like over and underrated. So I'll quickly say, I don't have too many filmmakers who I consider overrated strictly just because I find that a lot of the time, even if it's a director that I don't particularly appreciate what they're doing or enjoy what they're doing, I can understand why others would, and I do see value in that style existing even if it's not for me. That said, I don't want to cop out, so I will give you an answer, and I feel a little bit bad about it because I don't want to speak ill of the recently departed, but Jean-Luc Godard, I don't like watching most of his films. There's some exceptions. I really like Contempt, I really like Alphaville, and I think the first 45 minutes of Breathless in particular are exhilarating. A breathless entertainment, one might say. As far as films go that I think are underrated or underseen or really stellar examples of their genre that don't get the credit they deserve, the one that really sticks out to me is Michael Curtiz's swashbuckling epic, The Seahawk, which is one of the swashbuckling epics Errol Flynn made back in the late 30s and early 40s, but it's really overshadowed by the likes of Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood. And those films, especially Robin Hood, probably are better, but I do think The Seahawk is a really exciting piece of old Hollywood adventure and escapism. It's got a wonderful sense of history and the way that it intermingles its loosely based on a true story with a critique of contemporary fascism and Nazi Germany, I think is really informative to read. More generally, I think it's just a really entertaining and exciting film, and the way that it brings in some color cinematography for a certain section is rather beautiful and rather interesting in a thematic way. So that one stands out for me as an underrated film that is also an exemplar of its genre. Just Some Guy asks, did you ever see Valkyrie? What were your thoughts? I'm assuming by Valkyrie you mean the 2008 Bryan Singer, Tom Cruise Nazi movie. I did see it in theaters, oddly enough, when I was a young teen. Didn't leave much of an impression. I would probably need to rewatch it to talk about it intelligently, but it certainly didn't do much for me then, and it hasn't stuck with me at all in the years since. Riozan asks, what are your thoughts on Screen Junkies? I don't really think about Screen Junkies that much. Their brand of YouTube film is very rooted in like comic book movies and blockbusters, and I think it's a fairly limited perspective. That said, I will say often Screen Junkies and Honest Trailers in particular get lumped in with the likes of Cinema Sins as like bad YouTube film criticism, and I don't think that's entirely fair. I think Screen Junkies, while you can maybe criticize them as having a limited perspective, I don't think their form of media engagement or I hesitate to even say analysis, but media commentary is anywhere near as vapid and pointless as what the Cinema Sins people are doing. So they're not for me. I don't much care for them, but I don't see them as being like a active harm in the world of film criticism in a way that I think Cinema Sins really kind of are. Callie the Vampire Slayer asks, what is a movie you would actually want to see get a remake? Okay, so I have this pitch for not strictly a remake, but a reimagining of Amadeus. It's set circa 1998, and in the Salieri role, we have Steven Spielberg, and in the Mozart role, we have Terrence Malick. And the premise of the film is basically that Spielberg has made his magnum war movie epic, this opus in Saving Private Ryan, and it's reinventing the way the war film has existed in American cinema. New levels of realism and grittiness and violence that had previously gone unseen. It is the new war epic that will forever define how war movies are made. But a little later in the year, a little film called The Thin Red Line comes out. Terrence Malick's first movie in 20 years, and it is perfect. It is a masterpiece of film form. It is a war movie unlike any other. It's a war film that delivers the spectacle and the sort of bombast of a war epic, but is also quiet and nuanced and intimate and really thoughtful in a philosophical way that Spielberg's just isn't. And even though Like Salieri in Amadeus, Spielberg gets all the love. He gets the awards, he gets much higher box office returns, he gets all the accolades, and not Best Picture, crucially, but he does win Best Director. He, by all metrics, he wins if you're putting the two films against each other. But Spielberg knows. He knows when he looks at the Thin Red Line that it's better, that Terry beat him. And it frustrates and tears him up inside, because Spielberg has been making films nonstop since the 70s. You know, he's done Indiana Jones films, he's done E.T., he's done thoughtful dramas like The Color Purple and Empire of the Sun, Schindler's List, of course. Like, he's nonstop working. Terry goes away after Days of Heaven. We don't see him again for 20 years, and he comes back with this film, and he's editing and listening to Green Day, and he's this, you know, goofy, lovable guy, and just casually makes the greatest war epic anyone has ever seen. And, like, this that tears him up inside. This isn't based on any actual research. I have no idea if Spielberg felt anywhere near this about Terry. I doubt it. And I realize this reading depends on agreeing with me that Thin Red Line is better than Saving Private Ryan, but I think it is, and I am obsessed with this new version of Amadeus that I've concocted. So that's my remake, is Spielberg, or maybe Malick. Terry, that's what you call it. Terry. And you got Steve just being like, God damn, Terry. All this work I did, and I still get bested by a guy making his third film after 20 years, and he comes back and just knocks it out of the park. Ridiculous. So that's the movie I want to see remade. So 2 questions about video game adaptations. First, Cam from Chill Spot asks, what do studios get wrong about video game adaptations, and what do you think they need to do to really make it work? And second, from Nicholas Santamara, who asks, in your opinion, why do so many video game movie adaptations seem to fail with critics/audiences, and do you think there's anything that can be done to avoid these issues in the future? So I play video games fairly actively. I don't watch a lot of video game adaptations, though, so take this answer with a bit of a grain of salt. But I do think genuinely the main issue video game adaptations fall into is 2 things. One is that games generally fall on a spectrum surrounding how cinematic they are, that each pose their own problems for adaptation. On the one hand, you have games like Uncharted, which are so close to being movies that you play, that in translating them to film, you have to ask, well, what's the point? You know, the game is already so close to this, what can we really adapt? And on the other end of things, you have games that are really designed around being video games, and the way that the narrative and themes are translated is so inherent to an interactive medium that in adapting it to a film, you really need to fundamentally transform it in order to make it work. I think that's part of why the BioShock movie has been in development hell for over a decade, because that game, while brilliant, and while it offers a lot of great things to bring to a cinematic form, the core narrative is built around the narrative design of video games and the way in which a player kind of blindly follows instructions because that's how games work. The twist only works with that context. If you translate that directly to film, it falls flat. So in that regard, there's not necessarily an easy solution so much as it is a problem that filmmakers need to address of how am I adapting this to a cinematic form, either A, because it's already very cinematic, so what am I really bringing to it, or B, it's very uncinematic, and how are we going to translate that into a cinematic form? The other issue I think pops up is that, and this is somewhat starting to change now as younger directors are being given the reins to these types of projects, but historically, the filmmakers who have directed video game movies are not themselves really video game fans. So they're not coming, and that's not to say they don't do the research, but they're not coming at it from the perspective of a player and how it feels to play those games, but they're watching gameplay footage and then translating the footage to film or adapting the footage to film. For comparison's sake, if you think about the first few superhero and comic book adaptations that really succeeded, Richard Donner's Superman and even Tim Burton's Batman, maybe you have issues with how they adapt the source material, but both are coming at it from the perspective of like, how did I feel reading this comic book? What did I respond to in it, and how am I going to bring that to film? So I think thinking through the implications of the medium you're working in and bringing in filmmakers who are fans of the game, and I don't mean fans in the sense of like they respect the material or whatever. Like it's not about that so much as fans who have coming at this from the perspective of like, how did it make me feel when I played this the first time? And how can those feelings be adapted into a cinematic form? Marshall asks, what are some of your favorite debut films from directors? The defining one is Citizen Kane. I mean, this is such a great question, but the answer is always just Kane, because it's arguably the best film ever made, and it's also a first film, and it is also a first film that is both remarkably assured to the point that it feels like the work of a master, but it is also just an exhilarating watch. It's made with the excitement and energy of a young filmmaker. But I would feel bad just giving you Citizen Kane, so a couple other debuts that I really love. Hunger, Steve McQueen, I think instantly established him as a major voice in world cinema. Badlands, Terrence Malick, which is funny, now you go back and watch it and it feels like a more normal Malick movie. It feels like it's got a bit more of a clear psychological hook with the characters and a bit more of a Hollywood narrative. But I think if you were to watch it for the first time in 1973, it would feel just like a complete departure and something totally exceptional from everything else you were seeing, even with its connections to movies like Bonnie and Clyde. Mickey asks, a lot of people have been dumping on method acting and the auteur theory lately. What do you make of all this sudden disdain? Do you think it's justified? Okay, so this is a topic that don't get me started on. Especially the auteur theory stuff, that could fuel its own video one day. So I will very sort of briefly summarize. When it comes to the method acting stuff, I get why there's a resistance to it now, especially when you have actors like Jared Leto who are acting like complete assholes behind the scenes in ways that are at best weird and off-putting and at worst straight up harassment under the veil of, oh, it's method acting, I'm getting in character. I understand why there's a frustration with that term. That said, I do believe in its inception and the goals of method acting, the idea of thinking through characters and acting in terms of interiority rather than exteriority. I think those are good, valid ways of approaching film acting. As for auteur theory, all I will say is this. Most criticisms I see of auteur theory, especially modern think pieces about why auteur theory is bad, aren't actually addressing auteur theory. They are addressing a made-up sort of more casual definition of auteur theory informed by maybe how the term is used rather than what the theory is actually saying, and are more objecting to this idea of a pompous director than they are auteur theory itself. So I guess I understand in both cases why the resistance has cropped up, but with auteur theory in particular, I find that it is often misguided or incorrect in its assumptions. But those are topics for another day, so I will leave it there for now. Summer of Mark asks, thoughts on Romanian New Wave cinema? I think I've only seen 2 Romanian New Wave films, and those are films from Cristian Mungiu. His films 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, which I saw when I was a teenager, and I remember it being very impressive and very harrowing, but I would really need to see it again. And more recently, I watched his film Beyond the Hills, which I thought was an amazing achievement. I thought it was just a fantastic film. So I'm pretty underseen in the field, but I would like to see more because the 2 I have seen are just exceptional works of filmmaking. So I'm curious to see more. Esteban Rodriguez asks, what is your favorite final film from a director? The big one is Eyes Wide Shut. I mean, it's amazing that Kubrick went out on a genuinely masterful film, and I also find it just a really mysterious movie. In some ways, it actually marks a pretty major shift in his style. Most of the films he'd made up to that point, as great as they were and as ambitious and unique and artistic achievements as they were, they did fall pretty firmly within Hollywood genre. Horror films, war epics, comedies, science fiction. You know, he brought his own sensibility to that and in some ways redefined how those genres were thought of, but they were still American genre movies. And with Eyes Wide Shut, you have a film that feels more indebted to these contemplative European films from French and Italian cinema of sort of wealthy people, affluent people wandering through locations and just sort of weighing their own psychosexual issues. And there is a plot in Eyes Wide Shut, and you can describe it as a thriller, and if you really strained, it technically is an erotic thriller, but it's certainly not playing in any form that's even remotely close to something like Basic Instinct or Fatal Attraction. It really feels more aligned with something like La Dolce Vita or Last Year at Marienbad than it does American genre films. And so it's interesting that the film, all Kubrick films, I think, take multiple viewings to sort of understand better and more appreciate. But Eyes Wide Shut in particular, it stands alone in his filmography in a way that I wonder if it would have marked a stylistic change had he continued to live and make more films. So that film, I think, is a massive end accomplishment. But to throw out a bit more of a unique answer, I think that Before the Devil Knows You're Dead, the last film from Sidney Lumet, is a really great crime drama with fantastic performances, and while I wouldn't say it lives up to the likes of 12 Angry Men or Dog Day Afternoon or Serpico, I think it's a rather fitting end to his career, and I like seeing that a director who started in the late 50s was still able to do really compelling top-notch work into the late 2000s. I think that's a really impressive accomplishment and a testament to how great and easy to underappreciate Lumet was as a filmmaker. Musarani asks, what do you think about Eastern European animation? I don't think I've seen any Eastern European animation. What would you recommend I see? Christopher Gerald asks, which up-and-coming directors' films are you most interested in following as their career progresses? There's a ton. I think there's a lot of really exciting filmmakers who've emerged in just the last few years. But I'm going to say just two specifically. I'm going to go with the power couple, Barry Jenkins and Lulu Wang. Keir Wilson asks, do you believe film and art in general is objective? And this is another one of those big questions. I will just quickly say no. Obviously, there are certain artistic standards and in filmmaking with regard to image making, sound quality, and narrative. And I think those standards are useful for thinking about and being knowledgeable in, and using them as a measurement to some degree is not inherently wrong or ill-advised. But ultimately, no, I don't think there's like objective measurements of quality of like, film X is objectively superior to film Y. Dusty Gonzagas asks, what are some of your favorite guilty pleasure films? There's one big one, and it's Rocky IV. Rocky IV, which is not only dumb and pretty shameless in its propaganda, it is also, as my friend the movie Vampire on Letterboxd has argued with me in the past, a complete portrayal of what the series is supposed to be about, and how the humble patriotism that Rocky exhibits in the first movie gives way to garish and outlandish, just gross celebrations of Americana with such patriotic zeal that it's just complete garbage. And he's not wrong, and Rocky IV is pretty dumb, but man, is that a film that works its ass off to entertain you. It's got multiple musical numbers, montages, these fight scenes that are like maximalist. Every punch is the most epic thing. And yeah, it's pretty dumb, and to sort of think about it critically, it's a very frustrating film, but I do respect how hard it works to entertain its audience, and it works for me. I do find it extremely entertaining. Two completely random separate questions. One, are you a fan of the classic comedy teams like Laurel and Hardy, the Marx Brothers, Abbott and Costello, etc.? And if so, who is your favorite? Are you a fan of Robert Bresson films? If so, do you have a favorite? So regarding comedy teams, I haven't seen any Laurel and Hardy. I've seen the Abbott and Costello Meet the Monster movies. Not all of them, but I've seen like Meet Frankenstein and Meet the Invisible Man and Meet the Mummy. Of those, I really, really like Meet Frankenstein. I think that film is actually really great. And I love the Marx Brothers. I've seen not all their films, but most of their major works, and Duck Soup and Horse Feathers in particular are my favorites. Robert Bresson, I have not seen many of his films. Only two. Of those two, I am interested in his work. I probably need to explore it more. I really, really like A Man Escaped. I think that film is really good. Daniel Shakespeare asks, what are your thoughts on Duck You Sucker? I always think cinephiles skip over it, and in my opinion, it might be the best screenplay Leone's ever worked with. I like Duck You Sucker. I think of Leone's westerns, it's my least favorite, but that probably speaks more to how highly I value his other movies. I think it's interesting in that all of his films have this sort of sharp wit, but this one starts to really veer into being a full-on work of satire, which I think is pretty interesting, and there's a cynicism to it and its politics that I really appreciate. I think what holds it back in my eyes is that it feels like Leone had kind of exhausted himself in the Western, and with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Once Upon a Time in the West in particular, had really hit a zenith in terms of set pieces and grandeur and the mythology and myth-making images of the Western, that coming into this, he just feels a little bit burnt out. As much as I enjoy the film and find it fun to watch moment to moment, it doesn't have the iconography or the impactful images that his other Westerns do, nor does it have set pieces that come really anywhere close to those earlier films. So for me, it's one of Leone's lesser works. I'd put it just above Colossus of Rhodes, and that's kind of it. But I do like it, and it's a testament to how solid Leone was as a filmmaker that what I consider to be one of his weaker movies, I still think is firmly very good. My Owen Opinion asks, who's a director you think you'd get along with well if you met them? I would like to think Martin Scorsese would like me. Is that wishful thinking? Almost certainly, but I really hope you would. Ryan Grill asks, would you ever consider doing a video ranking all of Kubrick's films? Possibly. I've done a couple Kubrick now, and I think it's starting to become a known interest of mine. The other ranking video I've done, the big one, would have been the James Bond ranking, and that came after doing a series of Bond videos and coming to a point where I felt like I sort of said my piece. Which is not to say I'll never do another James Bond video essay. I'm sure there's a chance I will. I probably will at some point. But I had felt like I'd come to a bit of a conclusion with my time with Bond for now, so it felt like I'd earned just doing a fun ranking video. So with Kubrick, I've done a couple of videos now. If I ever feel like I've hit sort of a peak or crescendo of Stanley Kubrick analysis, then yeah, I'd be certainly open to doing a ranking at that point as a sort of reward for myself and as something a bit more fun and casual for my audience. Keith Connor asks, what's the worst film you've ever seen? For me, it'd be Dick Shark. 149 minutes of pure hell. Well, I've never seen Dick Shark, so I guess I can't speak too much to that. I don't know. I don't really think that much about, like, worst movie ever. The most unpleasant film viewing experience I probably had was The Girl Next Door. Not the sex comedy, but the horror film about a child who's tortured and murdered, although both films were released in 2007, so that makes it all the more confusing. Yeah, I mean, just a repentless, ugly movie that had nothing really to say and was made pretty poorly, while also dealing in material that I found exceptionally uncomfortable to sit with for as long as I did. That BoJack Horseman quote about a film that has nothing to say and says it badly really epitomizes that movie. There are other films out there that are probably technically worse, like on a technical level, or more inept in their filmmaking, but I really hated watching that film. So, Cherry Chase asks, which section of script writing is your least favorite or difficult for you to write? I assume when you say script writing, you're really referring to like the scripts for my video essays and not like movie screenplays. I don't know if there's any specific section that I struggle with, but there is a persistent challenge I face, which is basically when I get stuck. And what I mean by that is I know there are other writers who, when they hit a wall and they're not sure what to say next, they're like, well, I'll skip over to this other part of the video or the whatever I'm writing, the essay, and work on that, and I'll come back to where I'm stuck later. And I, for whatever reason, just cannot do that. I find that I really need to have like the scaffolding of what I'm writing, and everything needs to have like a sort of infrastructure before it to get to those points. So if I hit a point in my writing where I'm like, I don't know what to say, I basically just have to force my way through that wall. I can't just move on. I don't really have a good solution for it right now other than just muscle my way through. But if you watching this have a suggestion for when you get stuck on a part in your writing, how you face that problem, let me know, because I'm all ears. I would love to be better at facing those issues. DW Rocket asks, what has been the most surprising reaction to one of your videos? For example, have any of your videos gotten way more views than you were expecting? In some ways, the reaction to any video is surprising because I never really know how a video is going to do. Some videos I kind of suspect have more of a ceiling than others, but it's always a bit of a crapshoot. Every time I put out a new video, I kind of feel like I'm re-auditioning for a role that I already technically have, but I have to re-audition anyway. Probably the biggest surprise, though, would have been the video on villain reformed episodes in Batman the Animated Series, because I had no idea, I had no expectations that video would be successful, let alone one of my most viewed videos ever. And when I first released it, it debuted to like mid numbers, like average for the channel. I think when YouTube does its ranking of your last 10, it was like 6 or 7 when it first came out, and I'm like, that's fine, you know? And then over the next couple days and weeks, it just stuck around and then started building more and more momentum. And now it's, I think, one of the top 5 most viewed videos on the channel. And you might say, oh, well, of course it was. It's a Batman video, and you put it out around when The Batman was coming out in theaters. Of course it was going to do well. But I find that doing videos on established popular topics is less reliable than you might think. It might seem like on the surface that, oh, if I do a video on X, it'll clearly do well, but oftentimes it doesn't work that way. And in my own channel's experience, I had no reason to think a video on Batman the Animated Series is what my audience wanted. You know, the other Batman the Animated Series video I had done, the one on title cards a couple years prior, it had done okay. Like, for where the channel was at then, it did pretty average, solid, but not exceptional numbers. And so yeah, I had no idea that that any sort of Batman animated series video would be something that would be successful from me. But I think there's a good lesson there with regard to YouTube success, where a lot of the advice you get about gaming the algorithm and how to get 1 million views really quickly comes down to like put out a bunch of videos and then find whatever niche works and just pump stuff out in that topic endlessly. And this to me is a good example of why that doesn't always work, because if I followed advice like that, I probably never would have done a video again on Batman the Animated Series. I would have looked at the numbers and gone, okay, that didn't really work out. Avoid that. But I had an interest in the topic and thought, yeah, I'll do another Batman video, and if it does well, great, and if not, whatever. It's what I care about, and it ended up doing exceptionally well. So, moral of the story, take YouTube advice with a grain of salt at all times. Yggdrasil Illustrated asks, have you ever discovered a fictional character who you decided to emulate, and if that's the case, who? Homer Simpson, specifically when he cases himself in 14 karat gold and becomes King Homer. I love him and I want to be him. That's my role model. Marissa Rose asks, what was your first or at least an early favorite movie? Do you still love it? The first movie I remember being like obsessed with as a kid was Terminator 2. And while I don't love it as much as I used to, it's not even my favorite Terminator movie anymore. That'd be Terminator 1. I do still love it. So, yeah. Gray Fox asks, how do you reconcile when a director decides to disregard death of the author and make comments that contradict your own personal interpretation? Does it even matter if our interpretation doesn't match with stuff a director has said in random interviews that most people don't see? Good question. I did a video some years about sort of this topic with Night of the Living Dead and the Prison of Intent, but that's kind of a different circumstance. George A. Romero never contradicted readings that the film was about race. He just said that wasn't his intentions. But he never said, no, you can't read the film that way. Obviously, it is a bit different when a director puts forth an idea that runs completely counter to your reading. I guess it sort of depends on a case-by-case basis. I don't generally just defer to the director's judgment, but there have been cases where a director will say something about their work that makes me view it in a different light. I've never done like a full 180 on a film where I hated it and then the director said something, I was like, oh, now I love it, or vice versa. But there is things that just stop me a bit. Most recently, for example, Blonde, which is a film that I do like, but after I saw it, Andrew Dominic, I read his interview where he talked about how referred to the characters in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes as, quote, well-dressed whores. I was like, that does give me some pause. It doesn't necessarily change how I view the film entirely, but it does mean that certain aspects of the film that I was willing to give the benefit of the doubt or view in a certain context are then cast in some ambiguity of like, maybe I'm giving him too much credit, or maybe I'm giving the movie too much credit. So, yeah, I don't know if there's really a full-on strategy about like, this is what I do with that. I don't think it is overly deterministic when it comes to a director's statements about their work, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't place some effect on my own judgments. Travis Wise asks, what are the best examples of films where at least 90% of the running time is set in one single location? I think the crown jewel of this is 12 Angry Men. Most of it is just one room, and it is so engaging, and I actually find it remarkable that it's a film that oftentimes people who don't watch old movies really get into, and the fact that it does so while being set in one room is all the more an achievement. But I'll give a different answer for today. I recently rewatched Night of the Living Dead, and man, most of it is just in that house, and Romero really makes it feel like a dynamic location in spite of limitations. Aiden Kong asks, is there anything else apart from movies that you have a big interest in? Music, books, etc.? Yeah, I definitely have other hobbies. I mean, I love music. I've been a heavy metal fan, metalhead, since I was probably 11 or 12, and I love going to concerts. Have not been to any since the pandemic for obvious reasons, but it's one of my favorite things to do and something that I bonded with my father over a lot. I don't have any real critical, thoughtful insights into music, though, so it's not really something that is reflected much in the YouTube channel. I love reading. I don't read nearly as much fiction these days as I would like to, in part just because being busy with life and school and whatnot. And then something that's interesting is that since doing the video on Chris Benoit and art versus artist, I have started to get back into professional wrestling. Almost as if in finally making that video and finally, not just making the video, but really in reckoning with my feelings about him and what he did and how it made me feel as a kid and how it affected me, I was almost able to like get through some stuff, as melodramatic as that might sound. It was really kind of cathartic, and it was like after doing that, I was allowed to enjoy it again. And that's been really nice and fun. Nathan Montgomery asks, what are some of your favorite animated films? Well, you heard some of my favorite anime films earlier. I'll quickly add WALL-E, The Lion King, Fantasia, Watership Down, The Plague Dogs. Yeah, those are all great too. Audrey C. asks, any websites or online resources that you use to broaden your film knowledge? I don't know if there's one website specifically that I go back to often, but I do find it useful to read whatever you can online. And honestly, if you're a university student or you have access to any sort of library database, using that, you can find all sorts of interesting books, articles, essays. Really, it's an invaluable resource. So there's not necessarily a one resource I can point you to, but if you have access to any sort of database like that, it's worth looking into and taking advantage of. Jimmy Boyle asks, are there any directors you feel self-conscious about not having watched enough of their work? Is there any big director you have plans to tackle in the near future to change that? There's a lot, and there's one big one in particular, and that's Andrei Tarkovsky. Not because I haven't seen his work, but because the way I've engaged with his work so far has not been sufficient, and I feel it looks bad on me. The first of his films I ever saw was Andrei Rublev. There's a 2-star review of it from me on Letterboxd that haunts me, because I remember specifically when I watched it for the first time, and so far the only time, I was not in a particularly good place in my life. I was feeling pretty low, frustrated and anxious about where my life was going. Not for any like real dramatic reason. I just kind of generally felt like shit. You know how it goes. And a 3+ hour film that about a Russian painter was not something I was in the right headspace to really give myself to fairly. I was fidgety and anxious and just not able to focus on it, and I didn't engage with it fairly. Like at this point, despite a 2-star review, if you asked me what happened in that film, I could not tell you. In part because it was also a number of years ago now. And then many years later, I watched Stalker for the first time, and I really liked that, but I also was watching it on streaming, and for whatever reason, the connection was just garbage. So it felt like minute, the film would have to stop and buffer. And I should have just given up on watching it in the first place, but I stuck through and watched the whole thing. It probably took me like 4 hours. And I remember liking the movie, but the way I watched it was such a broken, fragmented way that I did not retain much. So he's a director who I've been meaning to retackle. And I did start this year by watching his first film for the first time, Ivan's Childhood, and really actually fairly looking at it and removing distractions and any baggage, and I loved it. I thought it was a fantastic, going back to that question about director debuts, that's one of the best ones. An amazing achievement that feels like a director who's been in control of his craft for decades, and it's crazy to think it was his first movie. So that has got me started on like, okay, I'm going to go through all of his movies that are currently available to me on streaming, which is actually most of them. So he's a big director I hope to tackle, and I'm 90% sure when I finally rewatch Andrei Rublev, which is next in my Tarkovsky marathon, that 2-star review is not going to hold up at all. It might. It's always possible that I'll rewatch and be like, wow, I actually don't like this, but I feel like it's safe to say I was wrong on that particular occasion and that the movie will probably play much better to me on a second viewing. Gavin Miller asks, was there a particular movie, director, actor, or film that sparked your love for cinema? How did the obsession begin? And there was a similar question from Random User who asks, more simply, how did you get into film? As early as like being a little kid, I remember being like a film guy and just liking movies. And as I got a bit older, I started to get DVDs often as presents, as kind of alluded to in my DVD dumpster dive video. So I always had a lot, and I sort of started to think of myself within friends groups as like the movie kid. But the first movie I really remember obsessing with was Terminator 2. And specifically because it felt like the first time I really clued into the fact that movies weren't just about the story and the scene to scenes, that they could be about ideas. You know, the fact it was the first time I started to think about like, oh, this film is really about nuclear war. It's really about living in a world that is fragile and feeling like you're living on borrowed time because of forces you can't control. And I don't know if I would have had the language to say that, oh, the apocalypse of killer robots is really a metaphor for the shroud of doom that is a potential nuclear holocaust. I don't know if I would have had the vocabulary to say that, but I could feel it when I watched it. And the fact that it was also like a sensational action movie made with like immense production value and skill it was like a perfect movie for what I needed at that age. It was probably about 11 or 12. When I got a little bit older and more serious about films, A Clockwork Orange was a major turning point. I kind of mentioned this in my Film Bro video, but I specifically remember watching that and just being like, oh wow, movies can look like this. Movies can sound like this. Like, it was so completely removed from anything I'd ever seen, to the point that it overwhelmed me with its style. Like, I couldn't even really think about the implications of like the violence or its morality. I was just like, wow, movies can look like this. That's amazing. It was the start of my affinity for Kubrick, which is kind of interesting now because I still love A Clockwork Orange, but it's in my bottom half of Kubrick films. But it was a really important one for me when I was a teenager. The Manchurian Candidate is another film that was really crucial to me, specifically because I remember that it was, a black and white old Hollywood movie. Realizing now it's not really an old Hollywood movie. It's very much a transitional one into the new Hollywood. But I didn't know that at 14 or however old I was. And I remember hearing it's a political thriller, so I thought, okay, that sounds politics. This is going to be boring. I wasn't the most sophisticated of teenagers. But I put it on and just within the first 5 minutes was just completely hooked in the story. And by the halfway point realized I had no idea where things were going, but I was riveted. And then getting to the ending and being completely devastated by the ending and realizing that's one of the greatest films I've ever seen. So that was huge for just opening my mind and thinking more, being more open to films that I maybe wasn't expecting much from. Then, of course, Kurosawa was a big intro to foreign language movies because his films were clearly thoughtful, clearly well-made, clearly engaging with deeper themes, but they were also rollicking adventure and action movies and thrillers, so they were still really easy to get into. So those were kind of the seminal films that developed my cinephilia. Another question from my own opinion: if you were in a Human Centipede, who would you have in the front and who would you have in the back? Why is it just a given that I'm in the middle? I got no say in this. I guess in any event, it doesn't matter. I'm just praying for death. Like, I don't think in that scenario I care too much about who's in it with me. I just want to die. Ryan Grill, what are your top recommendations for people who want to watch classic film noir? A lot of noir questions. I guess it's Noir-vember. That makes sense. I mean, I think the big three are probably The Maltese Falcon, Double Indemnity, and The Big Sleep. And if you like those, you can continue to expand. But if you're only going to see a couple, those are probably the must-sees. And I'll probably give you a good sense of if the classic film noirs are really to your taste. Crane Films 99. Thoughts on Michael Cimino's work? I've seen very little of it. I've seen Deer Hunter, but I haven't seen it since I was a teenager. I remember it being a fantastic film, but it's not one I went back to a lot, and I really I owe that movie a second watch. And then recently I watched for the first time Heaven's Gate, which I could spend a whole video on, so I will just briefly say is deserved better than it got upon release, because it's really not a bad movie at all. But at the same time, I do get why critics objected to parts of it, because it is sprawling to the point of being kind of sloppy in its structure, and there are elements of it that are, for as long as it is, quite underdeveloped in my opinion. But it's an interesting film that is well worth a look for anyone interested in Hollywood history. I certainly enjoyed it in spite of its flaws. Amar Yasser, what do you think of peak Hong Kong cinema? Also, what do you think of James Gunn? Finally, what do you think about my favorite film of all time, the anime thriller Perfect Blue? I love Perfect Blue. As you know, it's my second favorite anime film that's not from Ghibli, and probably would be in my top 5 anime films, even if you include that studio. James Gunn, I like him. I think as far as the modern crop of comic book movie directors, he's probably the best. I think Guardians of the Galaxy 2 was the best Marvel Cinematic Universe film. I thought The Suicide Squad was a lot of fun. Yeah, he's a solid filmmaker. I don't think I love him per se, but he's pretty good at what he does, and I'm always interested in seeing one of his movies when they come around to me. As for peak Hong Kong cinema, I think the only classic Hong Kong movies I've seen are some of Jackie Chan's movies, namely the Police Story films. The first one in particular is amazing, and John Woo's Hard Boiled, which is one of the greatest action films ever made, and the only Woo film from that period I've seen. I've seen some of his American films, but as his classic Hong Kong movies go, that's the only one I've seen, and this question is a good reminder that I need to see more of them, because Hard Boiled kicks ass. David Lozol asks, how do you get an idea for a video? It varies. Sometimes I'll be watching a film and something just clicks with me. Sometimes I'm reading something and I have some ideas in ways that I kind of want to respond to it or develop it further. Sometimes it's responding to a cultural conversation and I think I have a take on this. It really depends. Getting the ideas almost isn't the hard part. The hard part is maintaining them. Especially because video essays is not like the only thing I do. I have to balance it with my other job and with school and all sorts of other stuff. So recently I've come to having a dedicated journal just for writing down the titles of video essay ideas. I have separate journals for actually fleshing out ideas and taking notes on readings and expanding on stuff before I start writing a script. But I have one journal that's specifically just for writing down titles so that I have a reference point for keeping track of whatever ideas come to me, and I can, as they come, afford to put it somewhere secure and not have to fixate on it to remember it. Syrup Man asks, what's your favorite color? The color of money. That joke sucks. I don't even like that movie very much. And our final question comes from Nath Onion, who asks, how can I get into watching movies? The first thing is just to watch a lot of movies and to start to dive into various different genres and points of history. Obviously, that can be really daunting. You have a whole world of film. How do you sort of navigate yourself? And I think it's totally good to rely on curation. Look at lists of greatest films of all time, or lists of greatest films within certain genres. Like the AFI list, for example, is a lot of what I started with, and you can mock a lot of the AFI selections. They have blind spots, obviously. There are a lot of films in there that I don't agree with. There's a lot of stuff that's not there that I think should be. But in terms of getting you started, getting the ball rolling, I think that's super helpful. And then as you watch more, you can start to discover, ooh, I really like this specific genre, or this specific time period, or this specific setting. And you kind of do a little research, find more of that, and dive into that. Or this specific director, and you start to watch all their other works and get a better feel for them. And then the more you read about the director, you read about the films they really like and the films that they're really interested in. And then you seek those out. And, you know, not everything's going to be a hit. A lot of what you watch is going to be stuff that you don't like very much, or that you like, but doesn't really inspire that passion. But you need to kind of think broadly and be willing to explore and go in different directions. So that's one part of it. I think the other crucial thing is having some sort of community. Whether that can be people in like a film program, like actually going to school and studying film, but I don't think it needs to be that official. I think just having a circle of friends who are interested in film at various levels. I've had, since I was a teenager, both my sort of real life circle of friends who I know in person and would talk to like at school, who I would talk about movies with, but also meeting people online in online communities, whether they be forums or Reddit or social media, and sort of building a community around film. Having someone to talk to, it really enriches the film experience, and it also becomes enriching for friendships themselves. It's something I kind of alluded to in my video on the decay of cinema, but a lot of my friends, like a lot of our relationships are, I don't want to say defined by film. It's not like if we took that away, we would just have nothing in common. But it does help give you something to bond over, and it makes movies more than just, isolated entertainment units, but they become cultural, they become social, they become bonding rituals. And so yeah, I think those are the main things, is to experiment in your film watching and give yourself a little bit to curation from others, whether they be friends or whether they be more formal, like lists of the greatest of all time, and build a community around film. Discuss movies with your friends, with family, with the people who are close to you, and curate amongst each other. So that, I suppose, wraps up our Q&A. Thank you all for your support over the years. 50,000 subscribers is mind-boggling to me. I never expected to be anywhere near this, so it really does mean a lot. If you're really into the channel and want to support even more, you can head over to Patreon. I have all sorts of fun little bonuses for people who sign up there, including a monthly vlog exclusive for $5 patrons. So head on over to that if you want to support the channel. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting. I promise more video essays are on the way, and I will see you next time. Take care, everyone.